This is a narrative of the extraterrestrial scale of my story, combining what I've told so far into a single video and a single sequence of events. The story as it relates to my mission begins more than 1 billion years ago. There was a war between two sides that spread across the galaxy and threatened all life in the galaxy. Those sides represent what could be called freedom and control. Neither side wanted the massive level of destruction of life that the war was causing. If it continued, the war would lead to the end of most, if not all, life and, more important, evolution in the galaxy. As I understand it, the war involved a disagreement over the management of life and its evolution. Since neither side wanted the inevitable destruction, a truce was made. Both sides made compromises and established a political system where neither side could win, while they tested their ideas against each other through this political system and what would become of life at a certain point of time in the future. Most of the details have either been lost to history or sealed up information that only certain politicals are allowed to know. That political system has been in operation for about 1.3 billion years, which I assume to be modern Earth years. During the war, a small group of extraterrestrial aliens of a tall grey-like species abandoned their responsibilities and role in the war. They became separatists to the extreme and didn't want any interaction with anyone else, ever. They were some kind of cult. They sought a place to escape where no one would find them. They found what we call the Sol system, our solar or star system. One might also call it the Earth or Terran system. It was far away, in a place no one would look for them. At the time, the Sol system was a minefield full of debris that made navigation very dangerous. It was considered a hazard zone to avoid, a no-go zone. They settled on Earth and Mars, safely underground to avoid being hit by the constant falling debris. They later had to abandon Mars due to some kind of problem that made even living underground too dangerous. It was their understanding that the Earth was barren and lifeless. A long time passed. They had no idea the war had ended. A scout eventually came to Earth and found them. Primitive life was also discovered on Earth, which placed Earth under an automatic quarantine, which meant that they weren't allowed to be there because Earth was quarantined, as planets are automatically quarantined. They were suspected of planting the life, which was also outlawed. It was eventually decided that they didn't plant the life, that it evolved independently of them. Since they were living underground as strict separatists who had no interest or interaction with that life or anyone, they were allowed to stay on the condition that they don't interact with the life in any way, stay underground, and protect the life from anyone else who comes. A long time passed. Life evolved. And that's where I come into the picture, 13,000 years ago in the Middle East. At the end of an ice age, life had evolved to the point where I considered it ready to take control of its own path. My interest was in a certain branch of mankind, by extension the white race. And contrary to belief, popular belief, the white race inhabited the Middle East and other areas, but at that time. It wasn't full of Arabs and Jews and all, whatever you want to call them and all that. It's full of white people. Now, I considered them alone to be ready, not these other human groups, the specific type of human, the white race, and specifically this group that I wanted to introduce these ideas to. It was my task to gently introduce concepts such as heritage, morality, philosophy, written language, civilization, and more, from within, as one of them. I taught often, and a large following grew. But much to my frustration, I wasn't making any progress for a long time. They treated my teachings as entertainment, never taking it seriously and acting on it. But I continued for a long time, as a man like any other. But then something happened, a big problem. A group of extraterrestrial aliens came down and messed up what I was doing. In order to pacify mankind, they gave them technological trinkets and crumbs of knowledge. They introduced mankind to ideas it wasn't ready for yet, from a source that was itself corrupt. Advanced ideological viruses transferred to mankind and took on new mutations. The people I was trying to teach became progressively corrupted. They degenerated in the very direction opposite to where I was trying to guide them into. Mankind had a weakness to these ideological viruses through its primal nature. Blinded by the pursuit of pleasure and instant gratification, they lost their foresight and lived in the moment, abandoning their evolutionary heritage. The extraterrestrial aliens responsible for it were about 2 or 3 times the size of a human. They were pale and muscular, crossed between a grey alien and a cave troll. Humans feared them and avoided them. One of them could easily kill a group of humans. They always looked angry, but this might have been due to them struggling in our gravity and atmosphere. They are always hot-footing from one location to the other, between enclosures where they breathed their own air and possibly had their own gravity. I never went into their enclosures, but I saw several of them. They were white and made up of largely, but not exclusively, pyramids with a wall around them. The enclosures were all identical or close to it. The extraterrestrial aliens began taking human women. Only a few at first, but more as time went on. They explained that they were taking them as partners to make children, and that they would live a far better life. But no one ever saw any of the taken women ever again. There was concern at first, but the bribes of trinkets convinced mankind to trust them. And by mankind, I'm only talking about the white race, or a certain branch of the white race. There were no Asians in my story, but there were some blacks later on as whites travelled far and found them. Abandoning their heritage due to the corruption, some began taking blacks as partners. I was heavily against it, and tried to separate the races and keep the crossbreeds from infecting both gene pools and destroying their evolutions. While everyone else was scared of the extraterrestrial aliens, I stood up to them, criticizing them and telling them to leave. At first, they were surprised that this little human would be so confrontational. They quickly grew to ignore me, and if I stood in their way, they would just walk around me. Nonetheless, I criticized them heavily and challenged to debate them over what they were doing. Mankind was growing uneasy about their presence and taking my warnings more seriously as time went on, especially since they were taking so many women at this point. Theories were talked about on what was being done to the women. Many were convinced that horrible things were being done to them, but none of them dared to stand up to the extraterrestrial aliens, except me. My courage inspired the others to talk about it and agree that something has to be done, but they were still too scared to actually do anything about it. Eventually, one of them took me up on my debate challenge. We debated all day. Every now and then, he had to put on a mask attached to a container to help him breathe. He was very intelligent, but he couldn't fool me. I saw right through his hole of logic and reason. He didn't seem to be even aware of the hole. The very concept of morality was beyond his comprehension. The way they operated was always out of self-interest, yet they seemed to have no problem working together at the same time. They operated on a system of self-serving agreements with no moral foundation whatsoever. I tried to teach the value of morality to him. Eventually, I got through to him and he could see the massive hole in his reasoning, but he wouldn't admit it. He became angry and I caught him out in his lies. He became progressively angry as he had no defense. I showed him that what they were doing was wrong and that having no moral foundation means that their lives and species are parasites who don't have any value, meaning, or anything else to offer, which conflicted with and offended the superiority complex they all seemed to have. He became enraged and I thought he was going to kill me. But he stormed off instead. He must have spoken to the others because later, 3 others came for me very upset with the intention to kill me. As they came to me, I challenged them again and exposed their shame and toxic malignancy in front of a crowd of humans, in hope that even if I die, other humans might rise up and save themselves before it was too late. The extraterrestrial aliens backed off for a few seconds, confused by my courage and lack of fear. They didn't understand and were confused and even intimidated by it. They understood fear perfectly fine, but the idea of courage and heroism was beyond them. A few seconds after backing off, they came at me again, this time to grab and kill me. But as they did, a ship appeared in the sky and fired something at the ground between me and them, triggering explosions of dirt in the ground. They immediately ran away. The ship came down and landed. Another extraterrestrial alien came out and made his benign intentions immediately clear. He was a little bigger than a human and wore elaborate, colourful clothes of green, yellow and purple with dangling frills all over the place. He explained to me that he was a scout who explores and reports on what he sees. He told me that he was covertly watching the whole debate and had been watching the whole situation play out for a long time. He intended to sufficiently document what he saw for a while, enough to get a picture of what it was, where it was all going, and then go back to report it. But after everything he had seen, he decided that I was worth intervening over. He considered me anomalously enlightened and someone he could trust for a mission. He wanted me to be a messenger between this world and the governing authority far away. He took me into his ship and we left the planet. This is what it looked like from the curved view screen. As we travelled higher, I asked him many questions such as how we were able to fly. I didn't understand his explanations. As the world took on a spherical shape, I became alarmed. He could see how upset I was and he tried to explain things to me. He explained gravity to me, but I didn't understand. Somehow gravity holds things down on a ball, yet here we were defying it. I lost all confidence in gravity, lost my balance, became very nauseous and clung to the floor, not knowing whether I was going to fly off into endless space with nothing to hold me down. He tried to comfort me and asked if I was going to be alright. I told him that I think I will be, but it's a lot to take in. He stopped trying to answer my questions and stood there with a concerned look on his face, not knowing what to say. As we went away from Earth, I got my bearings again. Here's what his ship looked like facing the other way. The pattern on the ground seemed to be lighting up the dark room. The pattern centered around the back of the room, where there was a seat, depicted here in orange. Above and around the seat were all kinds of wires and tools dangling down that he was able to grab, pull down and move around. They appeared to be tools to control the ship. After everything was done, he explained to me that we would both go into a stasis chamber that would fill up with liquid and freeze to keep us safe for a long journey. And for our experience, it would have happened in no time. He had a spare chamber for me, but he had to unpack it awkwardly in a confined space, where he eventually just placed my stasis chamber on the floor. I asked him if he will be able to reach his own stasis chamber with mine on the floor, and he said without confidence that he will sort it out once I'm in my chamber. In this diagram here, you can see the ship from the top down. You can see the seat in orange. At the top in orange is the curved view screen. You can see the exit door and two small rooms, one on each side. The room on the right is where the stasis chambers were. He put me into stasis, and I somewhat panicked as it filled up with fluid and I was put to sleep. The next thing that happened was of him greeting me again. He took me to see some politicals. He had to teach them some basics of my language, which took a while. There were various people, mostly of a certain type of alien. They didn't speak to me, but constantly looked back and forth at me while they spoke in some other language. They were talking about me, but had no way of talking to me. Eventually, a political came to me and spoke to me in my own language. But the problem was, she knew so little of my language that we couldn't really communicate enough to construct a sentence. She became frustrated and eventually gave up. I was told that they would try another way. More time passed as they taught a language expert. He eventually came to me, and while we still struggled, we were able to at least communicate in a basic way. But as time went on, and I was there a while, they learned to communicate with me more. Enough to have a conversation, but very slow. They explained to me that they wanted me to be a messenger between my planet and them. I was to deliver messages back and forth, and be the tool by which the problem on my world would be dealt with. I didn't just speak as a messenger, I was the only ambassador of my world. So I also spoke with authority of an entire world. And all sides recognized that authority. They gave me a ship which looked like a bird with closed wings. Coincidentally, it looked just like the mythical Black Knight satellite, which is alleged to have become trapped in orbit 13,000 years ago, which is coincidentally the same time I was given the ship. They taught me some basic things, taught me how to fly the ship, and sent me on my way to deliver a message. This is what the cockpit of the ship looked like. It was small and cramped. The cockpit was a full-body seat and heavily inclined. There was a steering wheel that I could move along every axis. Pushing it forward made the ship go forward. Pulling it backward slowed it down. I could move the whole wheel not only forward and backward, but left and right, as well as tilting it up and down and steering it left and right, to move it along every axis. But the manual controls weren't necessary. The ship could be controlled entirely by an autopilot or commands from the semicircle panel surrounding the cockpit seat. Generally, autopilot was best for most things, by inputting a waypoint and setting speed, etc. Manual control was only useful for very short trips, such as maneuvering more easily and faster in the presence of another object, landing or swapping between space mode and planetary mode. The ship had those two modes, since it was a hybrid ship designed for both long-distance space travel and travelling on a planet. It was aerodynamic, and the space travel mode became less responsive as you travelled into a planet's gravity and atmosphere. Generally, I would take over manual control and switch to planetary mode as the space mode controls became unresponsive. On the top left and right of the cockpit were two screens that could be folded up and down to get them out of the way, or manually repositioned entirely. With difficulty, I only tried that once. The left screen monitored information inside the ship. The right screen monitored information outside the ship. The displayed information on the two screens could also be customized from the semicircle command panel, but it wasn't necessary. The view screen was narrow, curved, and grew wider as it went up very high. At the front, you can see the stasis chamber in orange. It didn't look like it was part of the ship. It looked like it was added to the ship and the only open space big enough to fit it. And so I passed on messages, back and forth between the two extraterrestrial groups and the governing authority, while I interceded for mankind and the planet. But the thing about long-distance space travel is that it takes time, a long time. By the time I returned to Earth, everyone I had ever known was long dead. The thing is, when travelling long distances, it isn't just the time it takes to get from A to B while in stasis. The faster you go, the slower time flows. So while any journey happened in moments for me, my ship would be travelling for a long time, and time itself would flow at a different speed, which would increase the amount of time that went by in the journey. So 1 year travel might mean 10 years or 100 years for everyone else at points A and B. So what would happen is that every time you travel anywhere, you're constantly skipping ahead into the future. But each time I came back to Earth, so much time would go by that the whole situation might have changed, and I would meet a new generation of people each time. By being a messenger, everyone I ever met would be long dead by the time I returned. In some ways, I was operating in my own timeline, experiencing small fragments of time on Earth over a long period of time. In my time on Earth, I would teach mankind and try to lead it to the right direction before leaving. Sometimes my teachings will be passed on, but most of the time what little of my teachings were passed on were misquoted and or corrupted consistently. Much of the time, in my arrival, the people of the time would know who I was, due to stories passed down about me. In my time as a messenger, the meddling group who caused the problem in the first place came and went several times, while very resistant to the warnings. If they didn't leave, the governing authority would come and remove them personally. For thousands of years in Earth time, I came back over and over with messages to the meddlers and teachings for mankind. The later stages of my time as a messenger mostly involved the group of extraterrestrial aliens who were hiding underground. They were only allowed on this world so long as they protected it from the intruders. But they just let it happen over and over. They were warned that if they didn't stop it from happening and do something about it, that they would be removed as well. Since they consistently did nothing and just sat there silently watching, they gained the name Watchers in a derogatory context, since they always just watched and did nothing. They might be the origin of the Watchers referred to in ancient texts. However, there seems to be confusion and overlap between the Watchers and the meddlers. The Watchers were not meddlers. They were separatists who refused their obligations to intervene, hence the derogatory meaning behind the name Watchers. They were called Watchers intentionally as a reminder that they knew exactly what was going on, knowingly and intentionally doing nothing, knowing very well the consequences, and that their original excuse of ignorance was bullshit. They abandoned their responsibilities more than a billion years ago, and they abandoned their responsibilities again when they just sat there and watched. Meanwhile, the popular modern version of the Watchers has no coherent explanation to why they were called Watchers, and it seems that different stories have been merged into one and confused for each other. The original story seems to have been lost over thousands of years of retelling. A long time passed during my time as a messenger. I was there from the very birth of civilization, and I saw it fail and restart over and over as it evolved. I never knew what to expect whenever I returned. While I never saw any of the children the meddlers claimed to be making, eventually in my time as a messenger I finally did. They lived alongside humans, and I had a long conversation with one of them. The most advanced of ancient civilizations had a heavy extraterrestrial influence, and hybrids were a part of it. But that was very late in my time as a messenger. The interference of a quarantined Earth got worse and worse over time, after they kept coming back while the Watchers did nothing to stop it. Eventually, the governing authority told me that my time as a messenger was done. They told me that they had already sent a force to intervene and cleanse my world of the foreign corruption. They told me that they would have to destroy a lot of life on my world and replant some of it to restore the natural ecosystem. They didn't want me anywhere near Earth, since they considered me clean of the corruption, and they didn't want to risk me being infected by the ideological viruses, since mankind was so vulnerable to them, and I was a man. I was too important to them to risk losing. They strictly wanted me as far away from Earth as they could get me, and they wanted me far away from the intervention they sent. This happened about midway between the start of my story 13,000 years ago and today. So cut that in half and the intervention they sent happened about 6,000 years ago. Not surprisingly, a dramatic and sudden event happened on Earth at the same time as the intervention in my story, about 6,000 years ago. An event that no one has been able to explain. Through history, the Middle East, where all this happened, was lush and green. This is why there is so much oil in the Middle East, because oil is made out of fossilized life that consistently lived there abundantly throughout history. 6,000 years ago, a sudden event caused the instant death of a large section of the world, from North Africa through the Middle East and as far as China. Central Africa is full of forests. Then suddenly, it's a desert, along an unnatural line. It was always lush and green, then suddenly there's a giant scar of death at the same time of the intervention in my story. No one has been able to explain how it happened. There is a consensus based on evidence that it all happened suddenly, for reasons no one knows. This explains the intervention in my story. It appears that they sent the intervening force to eradicate the meddlers along with all traces of the genetic corruption they caused. Not only does Earth have a giant unnatural scar of death, rain no longer falls there due to widespread moisture absorption from such a large area of dry desert. So the Earth is not just scarred, the rainfall patterns are also affected and the scar can't heal itself. With my time as a messenger over, the governing authority had big plans for me. They wanted me to join a team of 6 individuals chosen across different species across the galaxy. Only 5 others had been chosen, and I was to join them as the 6th. We were considered special cases, and extreme powers were entrusted to us and only us. We were given the freedom to do absolutely anything we wanted, and no law applied to us. But we were also given tasks that they wanted us to deal with. They considered us to be almost like deities, as though we were the executive hand of what might be God. They didn't place such trust in me and the others foolishly. They finally explained to me why they gave me such important tasks and why they trusted me so much. They had a way of seeing a distorted image of the future. They used technology on top of that in order to get a better picture of what they could see, into something they could use. The technology to do this was strictly outlawed, except for the governing authority for purposes of avoiding galactic catastrophes and maintaining the truce that was made more than 1 billion years ago, to lead it to its eventual conclusion. The ability to see into the future was a great power and a great responsibility. They explained to me that of the things they saw me doing very important things. That I was the one whose interventions would decide the fate of the galaxy. Since they sent me out into the galaxy to perform interventions, they had to give me tutorials on many things. But first, I needed to be upgraded. My body was failing from the damage caused by the freezing and unfreezing process of long-distance travel. Some species were affected by it more than others. I almost died several times from it. I would have to recover each time I went back to the governing authority. But now, I was to be upgraded and long-distance travel would no longer be a problem. I wasn't just upgraded, I was heavily modified. Organs were removed and replaced with artificial ones. I was given a specific nutrient organ in the same location of my stomach on the left. That meant I no longer needed to eat. I could go very long periods of time with no food and simply refresh the nutrient sac each time I went back to the governing authority. I could literally open up the front of my body and expose all my artificial organs. They told me that I could remove some temporarily, but certain ones I should never remove, and it was best to not touch any of it and just let them do it. My skin was replaced with some kind of armoured web structure that was practically indestructible. Because of that, I no longer needed to wear clothing. In order to communicate better, I was given a language interface that plugged into the side of my head. When they connected it, they told me it would take a while to learn how to use it. Time went by and nothing happened, and they started getting concerned. But then I finally made a connection, and it quickly came naturally as they said it would. I was given a universal language that was commonly spoken. They only gave me the one language, because they told me anything more can scramble a brain, and it's advised not to remove it unless I need to, because constantly connecting and disconnecting can also scramble the brain, sometimes permanently. Because of the language interface, I was now able to speak to almost everyone, easily. Other languages were eventually added to the interface as I needed them. I was told that language interfaces weren't common and were generally only used by the politicals. The politicals knew many languages. It is my understanding that they would have had them added one by one as needed, just as I was. But now that I could speak to them in their own language, we could finally talk freely. The language interface could also install written languages, but it was much more difficult. I only knew one written language, and I don't know where I got it from. I suspect it was given to me through the language interface. The written language I knew had excessive short and long straight lines to it. There were also universal signs, just like we have on Earth, across all languages. They weren't given to me in the language interface. I had to learn them myself. Arrows, directions, universal symbols for different things. But now that I was able to speak to them properly, it was time for them to teach me many things I needed to know for my mission across the galaxy. Species. There were countless species of extraterrestrial aliens. But there were distinct groups that they were classified under. Specific evolutions that were common. One bizarre classification appeared to be plasma or fire-based. I was surprised and asked them about it, and all they said was, it's just how they are. They didn't seem to be concerned about it. They didn't act like it was some bizarre thing. In a tutorial with a view screen, they showed me examples of these different classifications in 3D, like with models of different species and classifications, and certain stereotype types and specific species to be wary of for different reasons, such as who not to trust and certain body language to use or not to use. They taught me about what to do and what not to do with certain species, and to avoid some altogether. They even took me to places personally, and showed me firsthand. The governing authority operated in a mobile fortress that functioned like a hub for many species. So it was always busy, and there were many travellers around from many species. They were very diverse, but almost all of them had the same basic structure of 2 arms, 2 legs, bipedal, and a head with a mouth and 2 eyes. When it comes to teeth, there were all kinds of teeth, but I rarely got to see them. There were other things as well that weren't teeth, like gilled filters of some sort, but they weren't very common. It wasn't really often that I would be able to see anyone's teeth. It's not like they weren't showing them all the time, but on the occasion I did get to see teeth, and they were very different. Large and or black eyes were the most common. Human-like eyes existed, but there was also other bizarre things such as light-sensitive skin and many tiny eyes. But they weren't that common. It was just generally big black eyes were very common, of varying sizes and shapes, but they were similar to the human eye shape, just black and a lot bigger. There were noses of all kinds, but generally they were smaller than a human, or just holes in their head. Ears were also generally small or non-existent, but some of the rarer, stranger-looking species, like especially those with tentacles, had big ears all over them, with all kinds of shapes. Some species' legs were inverted at the knee, generally those that were the most agile. Those that had an inverted knee always seemed to be standing on their toes. Hair of different kinds existed, but it wasn't very common. Tentacles were more common than hair, but there were some covered in hair. Complete baldness was the most common, or close to it. One of the types of alien I was shown was a bug type of many kinds. It was one of the stereotypes. A primary kind was like a praying mantis, and they were taller than a human, but they were very bony and they kind of looked frail. When I first saw one, they seemed to have a small head and brain, and I was under the impression that they were very stupid. That impression was quickly changed when one of them spoke to me with a very wise, considerate, and human-like disposition and voice. Nothing like a bug. I was once introduced to very human-looking, white-skinned species with hair on their head similar to us, but they didn't have beards that I ever saw. A red-haired human-like species was considered very aggressive and violent, but they were an exception outside of the stereotype. Human-like species were considered a little less intelligent, but more balanced and creative. Most aliens had a bigger head size ratio than a human, in all kinds of shapes. My experience doesn't necessarily reflect the distribution of evolution across the galaxy, they were only my personal experiences. Sexuality. The vast majority of species had 2 sexes, male and female, that performed much the same role as humans. There were some hermaphrodites, but they were rare. There was a 3rd sex that only existed in certain grey species. It was looked down upon as a result of long-term sexual perversion and corruption. The 3rd sex didn't pass on any genetics. They were some kind of parasitic middleman between the other 2 that wasn't necessary, but facilitated the reproduction process in some way. Music was introduced to me one time only. I was speaking to one of the politicals, and the topic of music was brought up. He wanted to show me some music. He organised with someone else to give me an example. We met a third party in a large public hallway. He looked to be some kind of DJ. He carried a big awkward box with him. The box was very important to him, and it played very loud music. They didn't want to show me just any music. They wanted to overload and surprise me as some kind of prank. The music was very alien to me and resembled some kind of electronica techno, going at a fast speed with complex sounds. Since I hadn't been exposed to anything like that before, it was very confusing to me and too dramatic. They both thought it was funny at first, but the DJ went too far over the top and to the point where it also annoyed the political. It was the only example of music I was shown. I'm sure they had a wide variety of other music as well. There were no vocals in the music I was shown. It was a variety of electronic instruments playing sounds I had never heard before. On the Mobile Fortress, there were different daily cycles that operated at different times. They had active and inactive times just as we do. But since so many species had different daily cycle times, there were multiple daily cycle standards that operated across the Mobile Fortress. If you wanted to be in a public place during inactive times, you needed to pick a time where the cycles overlapped. The way it would work was that you would go to the Mobile Fortress and you would choose a daily cycle timeline that would match closer to your own. And sometimes you would be a little too faster or slower than that daily cycle and you have some problems, so you just skip to the next cycle for a while. Sometimes some people had to alternate between two different cycles, but usually it was generally fine that you would adapt to one cycle. All the human experiences such as fear, ego, humour and pleasure existed among alien species, but some seemed to be lacking in some areas. Some were energetic, while others were docile. Even those who were docile showed intense passion for some things, on the rare occasion. Here's what my hangar looked like, where I parked my ship alongside others. There was a large archway, domed at the top, leading into what seemed to be more hangars. There was a door to the left that went to many places. On the right was a different part of the fortress, city, space station, or whatever you would call it. That door had a short fenced stairway leading to it. No one was supposed to go in there except for the politicals. But the door to the left went to places that were free to move around in. I had a small office I barely used as well, a few hallways from the left door. I kept a few memorable artifacts there. Of the classifications, one of them is what you would call a grey. The name they gave to them was a description in the universal language of being weak, frail, and pale. Since I no longer have the language interface, I no longer have access to that language. All I have is a ghost image of association with the words. Greys were a common classification, but there was a specific region of space where half a dozen grey-like species evolved around the same area independently of each other. It was considered a strange anomaly that they were so similar. They ranged from 4 to 7 feet tall. It was considered the grey space, or the equivalent word they had for them in reference to their pale frailty. They all formed an alliance to dominate a large region of space that also included other species of different classifications. Greys generally had a bad reputation for being exploitative, manipulative, and shady in trade, often breaking contracts the moment it becomes an inconvenience. But there were exceptions to the stereotype. Generally, the taller the grey species, the higher rank you were in a grey hierarchy and the more superior you were considered. But this was only a relationship that happened between grey species. And not all of them were like that. Some, especially the extremely small types, were often upset about being thought of as being like them. They passionately hated the stereotypical greys for it, and loudly and vocally made it clear that if there was any doubt, aggressively distancing themselves from the stereotypical greys. There was a lot of complex relationships that went on, and reputation was a big thing. Debates. As part of teaching me how everything works, they showed me a debating platform they had in the Mobile Fortress. certain people would come a very long way just to debate. Understand that because of the time it takes to get to the mobile fortress and back, anyone who comes to debate will come back decades, perhaps hundreds of years later, to a very different world that might not even exist anymore. To travel at all comes at a big cost. So people who come a long way to debate don't do it unprepared and for shallow reasons. They are the best a world has to offer, sending their best philosophers to test their planet's ideas against others and learn what they can and bring back what they learn to their homeworld. One could even argue for something that is immoral or illegal, or that they don't personally believe in the name of exploring all argument paths, so long as they don't promote it outside of debate. People who come to debate don't simply come for one debate and leave. They usually stay for a very long time and debate heavily before they go back home. It's the same with all travel. People don't travel unless they have a very good reason to. And once they get there, they don't leave until they are fully done with what they came to do. Sometimes one must send a messenger back to someone else before they can make a decision on what to do next, which might take decades or hundreds of years. By the time the messenger returns, they might be speaking to their grandchildren, unless they also go into stasis. Consider this when considering the situation on this planet. Communication that happens and decisions that are made take a lot of time. Religion. It was a general rule to be as neutral as you could on matters of religion, theism, spirituality, or whatever else you want to call it. If you were too for or against the existence of a god, it was looked down upon as being irresponsible, untrustworthy, and taking ideas too far, which discouraged anyone from interacting and trading with you, since you were considered an unpredictable potential time bomb. Anyone who involved themselves with such groups were also looked down upon, so it was a general rule for your own good to distance yourselves from those of both extremes. Those who were the most neutral were trusted the most and experienced the rewards of it, such as more trade and freedoms within the space of others with a reputation for being fair and unbiased. It was explained to me as part of explaining the political system that religious cults were not a common problem. An example was given with one particular religious group they were concerned about, to explain to me how it all worked. If you became excessively religious, you would be progressively treated accordingly. First, everyone would peacefully distance themselves from you, especially since anyone associating with you would give them a bad name as well, and they would suffer the progressive consequences to a lesser degree. Then you would be progressively and openly criticised, giving you a bad name, pressuring others to distance themselves from you and revealing the holes in your ideology and the danger of it. Then there would be progressive trade restrictions and trade blocks placed on you. Then they would escalate armed territorial resistance on you, pushing you into a smaller and smaller area and eventually quarantining you. If at any point you planned or supported a holy war on anyone, you would be treated with zero tolerance. You would be invaded, and every shred of your cult would be completely destroyed and outlawed. Any violence or even threats of violence would be met with violence. Anyone who followed a religious book that commanded such acts was basically treated as though they directly supported those acts and planned those acts, because really that's what they're doing. So keep this in mind when you deal with ideologies such as Islam. Zero tolerance. In this way, the more religious you became, the more you suffered. And the more neutral you became, the more you were rewarded. This system maintained a balance in the exploration of ideologies with a more difficult path the further you went. I don't remember being shown any examples of the other extreme being such a problem outside of being ridiculed through debate, but they were treated with the same rule. Most explorers of religion kept their views private to avoid being identified and targeted. But there were open debates for that and every other topic. One could argue for a religious position they didn't hold themselves in the name of covering the exploration of all argument paths without suffering for it, as long as they didn't try to teach or promote it outside of debate. Technology. There was absolutely no concept of what we call a patent system. Technology was widely available, only limited to your exposure to it. And just remember that the galaxy is a big place. It's only limited to your exposure to it, compatibility with it, and capacity to use it. Any gain involved in technology was in regards to teaching it, trading it, and manufacturing it. As I understand it, self-reliance was a general rule. Independence was everything. There was some degree of limiting and slowing the exposure of certain technology to some younger species, but it was never forcefully restricted. Once the technology was adopted, there wasn't much that could be done without extreme investment into stopping it, which wasn't considered worth doing unless it involved outlawed technology. The only outlawed technology I knew of was of the technology to see into the future, which was restricted only to the governing authority, and the technology to heavily modify biological life and vastly extend its lifespan, the same technology that was used to modify me, which was apparently not outlawed for our special cases since we were above all laws. They didn't heavily enforce the rule and regarding life-preserving technology, and no examples of any action were ever shown to me. It was basically a general rule with no clearly defined line of taking it too far and making biological life immortal, or at least long-lived enough that it can cause a population problem. As far as I could tell, technology had long reached a climax, and little if any advances in technology were made for a long time. Advances only related to younger species and their incorporation and compatibility modifications of technology that had long been used by older species. And on the rare occasion it led to upgrades for others. There was still progress, but it was insignificant. I wasn't aware of any significant advances in technology for a long time. Food. In my time in the mobile fortress, I didn't eat food. Nutrients were put into my body in a variety of ways, such as filtering my blood and swallowing nutrient capsules. While human cultures heavily focus on the pursuit of pleasure and consumption, they did things very differently. There was no focus on food and the primitive pleasure of eating. The pursuit of pleasure was seen as something primitive, animalistic, and looked down upon. Since I dealt with people who travelled long distances in space, the need to bring massive quantities of food was avoided by using a nutrient organ in most, but not all cases. Nutrient organs were common, and they were refreshed in medical facilities that did a variety of things soon after you arrived. Before I was given a nutrient organ, I went on a tour eating different food from different alien cultures. I was told that once I got the nutrient organ, I would have a very different digestive system and wouldn't be able to experience food in the same way anymore. So I delayed getting the nutrient organ to first experience different food from different alien cultures while I could. There were small cafe-styled areas in the mobile fortress that dealt with providing a food experience. They weren't used for everyday eating, but for one-off experiences of different foods. I was the only customer at each cafe I went to, so they weren't busy. But I was only taken to them during times of minimal activity so that the chefs could devote all their attention to my meal. They were expecting me to come, and even excited about it. They understood the situation. One of the politicals took me to them as a guide. There was some kind of currency involved, but he dealt with all that. The chefs weren't just making food. What they did required a vast amount of knowledge and skills. It was an art. They had to have a conversation with you about what kind of food experience you were looking for. They didn't simply have a menu of options. They had to have all the details of your species, what you could eat, as well as any personal factors that mattered. They would recreate a similar version of the original alien food, usually made of replica or modified ingredients that would taste and behave closely to the original, as something you were able to digest. I mean, when they were able to use direct ingredients, they would, but usually there was some. They had to be modified at least, like atomically modified or something like that, just so that it wouldn't interact with your body in the wrong way. There were a lot of factors involved, and you wouldn't know what they could make for you until you had a long conversation with them and it was all sorted out. The experience was about learning alien cultures by walking in their shoes. I went to a variety of cafes and explored a list of different meals before finally getting their nutrient organ. The meals were generally the same as you would expect from a modern restaurant, with a plate and utensils that mimicked the original alien culture. More than just food preparation, the chefs were teachers of alien culture, and they would explain the story behind the food and the culture it came from. When eating a meal, the chef told me about the meat and the history behind it. The alien species farmed the large four-legged animals that were crossed between a dinosaur, a rhinoceros and a cow. But then there were problems that threatened their food source to the edge of extinction, and they had to dramatically change how they farmed, processed and ate the meat. It was culturally reflected by how they conserved the meat in smaller portions and prepared it more elaborately. But there was a big change that happened. It was taboo to criticise a species for growing animals for meat, since many species were dependent on meat. It was considered wrong to shame them over it. It was looked down on for farming animals the old-fashioned way, but still taboo to mention except for hunting or abusing them, which was openly criticised. There were other methods of growing meat, such as growing it or growing the meat itself, or genetically modifying the animals to grow without a brain. But it was understandable that some weren't able to do that yet. Herbivores were widely considered inferior for the most part because of their submissiveness and frail bodies, but that was also taboo to criticise. There didn't seem to be any hostility over it between herbivores, omnivores and carnivores. It was just considered inappropriate. It wasn't difficult to spot a carnivore from a herbivore just based on their appearance. In all my experiences, I never saw any animals, or plants or anything. Generally, everyone travelled light. They didn't even carry any excess luggage or anything. The only time I ever saw anyone carrying anything was some kind of small luggage when it come to those who had just come from their ships and they're carrying something important in like a, maybe a briefcase kind of carrying bag. But generally, everyone travelled just by themselves. They didn't carry anything with them. No pets, no anything. So I didn't have any interaction with any other animals, but or plants or anything. But as I understood it, that there were plants and there were animals, and different species ate different things, and that reflected the size of the body and their disposition and everything. But I didn't experience any of that. I just knew, I was aware that it was going on, but no one ever brought any of that stuff onto the mobile fortress or anything that I ever saw. When given my mission, I expected to be doing some kind of important political work as a leader and teacher. I was very disappointed in what they gave me instead. They wanted me to deal with the drone problem. They assured me that this was the most important and imminent threat to the galaxy. The drones were a group of small, chubby, grey-like entities. They were biological, but they weren't exactly alive. They had no consciousness. They only had a brain. They only had the brain matter to maintain automatic biological functions. They were given a programmable artificial brain to turn them into biological automatons, servants or slaves to do as commanded. They were very stupid, clumsy and unreliable. They constantly had to be supervised because they frequently made mistakes or misunderstood commands. They were created by a tall, grey species that looked like them. Their creators were tall, but they were small and chubby, like child versions of themselves. They made them a long time ago. But they gained a bad reputation for using them as sex slaves and for other degenerate acts. Like making them do stupid things and hurting themselves and accidentally killing themselves is some kind of sick humour. But it was generally the sex slave problem was the biggest problem with it. Other species started using them for sex slaves as well. Eventually they were forced to abandon them to avoid a trade boycott. Instead of destroying them, they just abandoned them and expected them to stand there waiting for instructions and eventually just die. And that's what seemed to happen, until there were rumours of them appearing in random places and behaving in strange ways. The rumours grew, and evidence of them started coming. They appeared more and more and began causing problems. In the strange, unpredictable way they behaved, they began causing harm. As they multiplied, they began appearing everywhere, doing strange, unpredictable things. Sometimes they would stop what they were doing and suddenly go inactive again, or completely change what they were doing. No one knew who was commanding them and for what purpose. They turned into a plague and their actions became more malign as time went on. They began kidnapping millions of people from planets, covertly, and randomly mutilating and killing them. The plague of drones led to any interaction with them at all being strictly outlawed, in case they misunderstood something as a command. No one wanted to set them off. No one knew where they were coming from or where they were getting their commands. They were like a virus, multiplying everywhere in dark corners and sometimes inflicting great harm to planets. And even travellers who would go missing after going near an infestation of them. It was a big mystery that turned into a plague and the galaxy's biggest problem. It was draining resources from and destabilizing the billion-year-old galactic peace and political system, and various dominant parties were threatening war. I was sent out into the galaxy to destroy the drones, find out where they were coming from and who was controlling them and why. There was no consensus on the matter. Some wanted them all destroyed, while others defended them, driven by parental instinct and seeing them like vulnerable children. Should they be completely destroyed? Should they just be culled? Should they be fully protected? No one could agree, as the political situation atrophied. It was established that they definitely had no conscious brain, that they were mindless automatons, but some just couldn't see past their parental instincts. The situation appeared to target and prey upon the greatest vulnerabilities in relations between different groups, as though that was the plan all along, to systematically take apart and destroy galactic peace and the political system through the drones as a proxy. No one could find a pattern in the drone locations and actions, but the result of what they did on a large scale was very predictable, and everyone knew it would lead to a breakdown of politics and an unavoidable catastrophic war. The drone situation seemed to know how to mess with everyone in just the right way. In my time dealing with the drone problem, I went very far to investigate reports of a massive infestation of them. I arrived near a bright, ice-covered moon. This was in deep space in the middle of nowhere, but there was a slow, primitive cargo ship all the way out here. I contacted and questioned them. They were resisting my questions and not giving answers, diverting and delaying me in a very obvious way. At first, they wouldn't tell me why they were there. Then they lied and changed their story. Then they admitted they were there because of the drones, but claimed to have only been interested in illegally using them, but hadn't actually interacted with them yet. Clearly they were full of shit, and I caught them in the very act. I told them that I was under strict instructions to destroy the drones along with anyone caught interacting with them. I told them that I was supposed to destroy them. I enabled the weapons on my ship, which were only enabled or added to the ship after my time as a messenger was done. 2 prongs came out of the front sides of the ship and charged up. I could fire them without charging up, but if I charged up, I could destroy them with massive damage in one hit. I charged up the weapons and almost fired on them, but I felt pity on them. They were living in very poor conditions, stuck in deep space, living in a slow, primitive cargo ship with no stasis chambers. They would live out their lives on that ship before they reached any destination. And here they were in the middle of nowhere, after a long, unexplained journey. I decided to let them go and warn them to leave and leave quickly before I changed my mind, and never return else they will be destroyed. But instead of leaving quickly, they just took their time and seemed disinterested in their own survival. Eventually, they slowly left and took their time doing it. I then went on to the drones. There was an old abandoned space station in orbit around the moon. The whole station was powered down and dark, and I had to find a way to turn the lights on. Once I did, I could see a large number of drones huddled together in the dark and inactive. I discovered maybe 2 million of them in total, all huddled together out of the way in open spaces in some kind of storage mode. They woke up with a command, but they just stood there waiting for more commands. I wasn't too familiar with their command structure yet, and tried interacting with them in a variety of ways. For the most part, they were unresponsive. They answered a few simple questions, but I had to be crystal clear in which drone I was asking, else they would just not respond. I tried to probe them for any kind of consciousness or reasoning, but no one was home. They were completely mindless automatons. I even took one away from the group and hit it several times, telling it to defend itself. It just stood there and took it, not responding. I knocked it to the ground, injuring it. The others just stood there unresponsive, while it got up off the ground, stood up, and walked back to the group, huddled together. They had absolutely no sense of self-defense or preservation, and operated on a simple set of commands. I decided to destroy the facility. I planted a bomb on the station and fired on it. In my time dealing with the drone problem, a Grey leader from the Grey Alliance, and one from the tallest and most authoritative species at that, was spotted suddenly coming in unexpectedly while I was talking to others at the mobile fortress. We immediately stopped what we were doing and dealt with this rare opportunity to speak to one of the elusive Greys who only ever interacted with others when it came to trade. He seemed to be in a dark room with a bright light shining on so we couldn't see him. I could make out something in the background, but it was too dark to define it. I silently watched as they talked to him and asked him about the drones and whether he knows if any of their Grey Alliance could be responsible. He was aggressive right from the start, and offended at being contacted, and even more offended at the topic. He wasn't receptive to dialogue, and wouldn't answer questions. Eventually, they put him on hold and asked me if I could try talking to him. I disagreed. I wasn't properly prepared and equipped to deal with a Grey leader, and had never spoken to one directly before. I had only just installed their language into my language interface, and hadn't even tried it yet. They assured me that the language interface would work, and that I could speak to him like normal. I reluctantly tried it. There was only one problem I had. A vowel I couldn't speak from their language, similar to A. So I just said A, let's pronounce it with an A, hoping that he would understand. He seemed to understand. He was less aggressive with me, but still wouldn't give out any information and answers. Then we all spoke to him together, and he began became very upset and accused us of accusing him of being responsible for the drones. Then he cut off the communication, leading to a lot of disappointment. Before we spoke to him, we were talking in the same place at the same console about another rare communication that had recently happened at the same box-shaped console with a screen in the middle. Where we were, it was kind of off the main station areas. There was it was a section attached to the mobile fortress, and it was like some kind of communication area. Anyway, I was there to witness an expected rare message from a nearby galaxy. While we waited, they ran me through some history and showed me the screen of the console. As a screen on the console. They showed me some past recordings of messages sent back and forth between our galaxy and theirs. It took a very long time for messages to be sent and received, and only a significant galactic power had the resources to send one of these messages. So this was a message between two dominant galactic governments. The dialogue was very slow over a long period of time. Before the message came, I saw two different images on the view screen of the console. One image was of the two galaxies side by side. Our galaxy was clearly bigger, while the other galaxy was about 2/3 of the size. The only galaxy this could be is Andromeda, since that is the only nearby galaxy and all others are very far away. Another image on the view screen was a perspective of the two galaxies. I could see our galaxy below and the other galaxy in the distance. There were controls on the view screen panel that let one navigate the 3D image, and they told me to have a go at it. It was disorientating at first, but I quickly got the hang of it, how to zoom and rotate perspective. I moved around and noticed some faint clouds here and there, but there was one that stood out, between the two galaxies, closer to the other galaxy on the left. It was a cloud, a cluster of stars that appeared to be triangular. I didn't notice it at first until I started zooming in. It became clearer and brighter as I got closer to it. It appears to be in the same position of Triangulum, depending on which map you're talking about, because some maps say that it's on the right, some say it's on the left. Well, this is on the left. In general, it's the same kind of position that some maps today say. So it was in the same position, general position of Triangulum, but it didn't look like Triangulum of today. It was a compressed cloud that didn't have a spiral like Triangulum of today appears to have in photos. It was like Triangulum of today, but without the spiral. Maybe there was a spiral it's possible that I was just looking at it from the wrong angle, maybe, but there was no spiral from what I could see. While Triangulum is agreed to be near Andromeda, scientists and astronomers are not sure whether it's closer to us than Andromeda or further away. In the 3D image I saw, Triangulum, or what appeared to be Triangulum, was on the left, relatively close to Andromeda, but definitely between Andromeda and the Milky Way. So it was on this side of Andromeda, closer to us than Andromeda. I noticed it as I zoomed into Andromeda. As I came closer, it went brighter and took my attention. I moved toward it instead of Andromeda and asked about it. They told me that they sent a message there a long time ago and got no response. As far as they were concerned, it was devoid of life. I felt pity on what life might be there, how alone it might be not knowing if anyone else was there. And I asked if they would send a message again to see. But they told me it took a lot of resources to send a message and they had to prioritise and were only concerned about the much larger galaxy, the only item of nearby significance, which appears to be Andromeda. The dialogue was based on an understanding that the two galaxies would meet in the future as they are on a collision course, so it was best for them to get to know each other before we meet. But the communication we were waiting for was a big disappointment. They explained that they knew of our wars in the past and didn't want our problems spreading to them. They wanted to break all contact and admitted that they were intimidated by our size and that we had much more life than they did. So it wasn't just that we were a little bit bigger than them, we had a lot more life than they do. So life is not evenly distributed across two galaxies that appear to be similar. There's some kind of dramatic difference going on in the distribution of life. Shortly after the long-awaited disappointment, 2 more messages were received, somehow riding at the end of the carrier signal. They came from 2 other parties in that galaxy. Both parties told the same story, that they were at war with the other 2 sides. They portrayed the dominant party as being oppressive and dishonest and not representative of them. They both wanted to continue communication. Unverified, smaller scale communication over time between the 2 galaxies backed up what these messages were saying. I should add that while I've always known that Andromeda is smaller than the Milky Way, so-called scientists and astronomers on Earth have universally agreed without contention that Andromeda is at least 3 times the size of the Milky Way. That it's massive and it's going to eat up the Milky Way. Here I have said the total opposite all along, and I have a video proving that I said this in 2016. 2 years later, in 2018, new measuring tools have revealed that all their previous measuring tools are catastrophically wrong, and they have had to start over and rewrite the textbooks. In humiliation, they first admitted that Andromeda was much smaller than what 50 years of science and astronomy have universally believed. Then they quickly go a step further by saying, in the very same day, that they were about the same size. Andromeda wasn't just smaller, they were about the same size. Then on the same day, I think it might have been the next day, they quickly go a step further and admit that Andromeda is smaller. So it was like a quick multi-stage admission that they had it all backwards. I recently looked up the size estimate of both galaxies on Wikipedia, and the range of the estimate is massive, because as much as they pretend otherwise, they really don't know and they're making a guess at best. In the Wikipedia estimate, Andromeda is presently anywhere from twice as big to twice as small, which fits perfectly with what I saw for myself, which looked visually to be about 2/3. Just remember that. From a visual reference I saw, with the galaxies side by side, Andromeda was about 2/3 the size of the Milky Way. Since the mobile fortress of the governing authority moved around, it was often not at the same location I left it. So when returning, I would have to go to the previous location, and if it wasn't there, they would have left a beacon that could only be accessed if you communicated with it in the right way within a certain close range. It would contain information, including the next destination and how long it would be expected to be there. Sometimes the mobile fortress was in the same place, but often it moved around, and I had to sometimes track down several beacons in order to find it. It moved around for political reasons, as needed to deal with things personally, but it also moved around to avoid being potentially ambushed and raided by opportunistic parties, which seemed to be more of a potential threat than a realistic threat. It was more of a safety precaution thing, just in case. In order to access the beacon, you had to get into close range and know exactly where it was with enough accuracy to find it, and verify yourself as a trusted party and know exactly how to actually access it, or it just wouldn't respond at all. So you wouldn't be able to find it, and you would have to send it a message in close range, blindly, in order to get a response from it. There were different levels of access for different trusted parties. One of those access levels were for the general population who were registered as a civilian traveller. Because of my position, I had to access I had access to exclusive information within the beacons and a special channel reserved for any emergency messages I needed to know. I have no idea how safe the encryption of the beacon was against being reverse engineered, but the fact that you had to know each beacon's location very accurately in order to find it and get a response meant that any illegitimate party would have to track it down and reverse engineer every single beacon in a sequence, which would take a very long time. Maybe they had other security measures on top of that, such as when the beacon was attempted to be reverse engineered, it would send a message to the to the governing authority to let them know that there was an attempt hack or something. I don't know. But they didn't seem to be concerned about it. So whatever system they had up seemed to be, they weren't concerned about the security of it. There was a matriarch I dealt with during the later stages of my time dealing with the drones. She was a leading political. She was of a long-lived species that lived for 3,000 years and dominated the political realm. Due to their age, they were able to consolidate a lot of power and influence, and they had a reputation for being unfairly criticised and treated with suspicion because of their age and the fact that they could consolidate so much power and influence. The species was very similar but not identical to what you would consider a Salarian from the video game series Mass Effect. She was bluish grey and had a larger brain cavity than a Salarian, without the two prongs a Salarian has with their head split in half. Looking into it, the original Salarian designs had no such prongs. They appeared to be an aesthetic addition to the final drawing. The matriarch always wore what appeared to be a symbolic hooded robe. Coincidentally, Salarian politicals in Mass Effect also wore a symbolic hooded robe, but the matriarch robe was much looser and very different. I didn't have all these pretty patterns and shit on it. It's too coincidental that she looked almost identical to a Salarian, and yet her age was inverted to a Salarian. Salarians lived very short, immature lives, while their species were the other extreme and lived very long lives with the disposition of being wise and responsible with a long-term focus. They were the second longest lived species mentioned to me. When she told me how long they lived, I asked if they were the oldest lived species or if there were others. They told me there was another well-known species that lived longer. That other species was self-serving and didn't have the right disposition for the political realm. Their longevity was a detriment, not a benefit. So maybe there were other species who were longer lived. They just mentioned the one in reference to my question. One time, about 2,000 years ago, I was passing near my homeworld. I decided to stop by. The governing authority didn't want me anywhere near my homeworld in fear of the quarantined ideological viruses spreading to and corrupting me as well. But while they didn't like me doing some things, I wasn't strictly commanded. I was free to do as I chose, even going against their wishes. So I decided to stop in on the way through, just to see how things were going. As I came into the atmosphere, the space mode controls became unresponsive, and I switched to planetary mode and took over manual control. As I came close to land, I pulled out the 6 landing turbines that came out of the sides of the ship. I always disliked that part. The turbines were very loud and powerful and caused a big dust cloud on the surface, scaring away any people and animals nearby. I decided to look for a better place to land this time, and just so I didn't disturb anyone, and chose a small lake that I wouldn't scare anyone and disturb the ground. But there were some people there as I came down. They reacted in a strange way, not scared of me. There was some kind of religious ceremony going on. I decided not to interact with them any further and directly, avoiding interfering with whatever they were doing since they appeared to be worshipping my ship. I just wanted to see that they were at least still alive and had some kind of civilization going. I left without coming out of my ship. Coincidentally, this fits the timing and the story of Jesus as he was baptized by John the Baptist. The story says that 3 entities were there. Jesus was being baptized while God spoke from heaven, and the Holy Spirit came down like a dove while the voice from heaven above it spoke. This is the only reference to the Holy Spirit or anything related to God being in the form of a dove. And that is the only reference. Coincidentally, the shape of my ship was that of a dove without its wings extended. So perhaps this coming down of the Holy Spirit was actually my ship. More time passed, and as I returned to the mobile fortress, I noticed that it was way out of position and very close to my homeworld. When I returned, one of my team, a green female alien with thick tentacle-like hair, confronted me about the drone problem. She was convinced of a big conspiracy, that there was more to the situation than the governing authority were telling us and that they weren't allowed to. She was convinced of the same early conclusions I made myself over the situation, that someone was behind the drones and intentionally using them as a proxy to destabilize the galaxy, and that it had something to do with the war that ended more than 1 billion years ago. I wasn't convinced that the governing authority were hiding a gold mine of information from us. She had a plan to prove it. She invited a high-ranking political to meet us and have a talk about the subject. She told me that they would respond in a very unusual and highly specific way without confirming or denying it, because they weren't allowed to talk about it. In the conversation, they responded exactly how she said they would, word for word. She understood the political realm far more than me, and you might consider the political realm an expertise of hers, at least compared to me. She was very familiar with the whole system. After they responded exactly how she said they would, I took her claims very seriously and sided with her ideas, which were also my own suspicions from the start. We planned another meeting with the matriarch herself. We told her everything we had come to discover, and that we knew they weren't allowed to talk about it until we independently figured it out on our own. She confirmed some things, but said she couldn't talk here. She took us through the door into the restricted political area and into a dark room. There was computer communication equipment all around the room with the same general and simple square and rectangle theme that computers seem to have throughout the mobile fortress. No curvy, futuristic computers. All these computers were square and rectangle basic shapes. In the center of the room was a square green table with computer terminals on all sides. It seemed to be some kind of 3D image generator, but everything in the room was turned off and inactive. We went into the corner of the room and she began talking openly. She confirmed all our suspicions were true and told us about the problem and the new situation on my homeworld. She explained that my world had breached the barrier into space. She said nothing about going to the moon, only that my species had entered space and breached the barrier, therefore ending the quarantine and placing my species under the same rules as everyone else. And since my species was considered violent, aggressive and invasive, the rules were that my species had to be destroyed. The use of nuclear weapons on my world got their attention, and after getting their attention, they witnessed mankind breach the barrier into space. These strict rules of exterminating invasive species after they breach the barrier is part of the truce that was made more than 1 billion years ago. It was a necessity to protect all life and avoid another war and genocide. Where two or more parties cannot coexist, a choice simply needs to be made. One often needs to be completely eradicated to protect the others, and that's the argument behind it. But since this was a new development, they hadn't yet acted on the rule and destroyed my species yet. They didn't just destroy one species either. They destroyed the very genetics related to the invasiveness, which can involve whole branches of evolution. Sometimes it meant completely destroying life on an entire world. But there were other factors that came into play as it relates to my world. And it all centered around the billion-year-old truce. The sides behind it, who unexplainably disappeared after the truce, their reappearance and an imminent conclusion to it all. In recent times, there have been rumours of strange battles in space between two unknown sides using unknown advanced technology never seen before. No physical traces of any debris from these battles were ever found. The rumours were proven true, as more of these battles appeared all over the galaxy, each time with no physical traces of it ever happening. With the drone problem, the political system rapidly falling apart, and the two sides behind the ancient war and truce making an appearance, it was all connected and coming to a conclusion. And then there are the prophecies. I was given an old book to read, which was a compilation of prophecies, many of which referenced a man today known as Jesus. They didn't say that I was this Jesus, but they did say that the prophecies all referred to me. I looked into it and read what they gave me in a strange language, the only language I was able to read. The closest earthly language to it would be Arabic, but it was definitely not Arabic. It was just a little bit similar in the fact that it had an excessive amount of straight lines and in short and tall length. There were many quotes from historical figures in the text compilation they gave me, and it was clear that most of it was word for word a copy of what I have taught mankind since the beginning. But some of it had a few words changed here and there that dramatically changed and corrupted the context. And different stories seemed to have been put together and corrupted into a completely new story. There was a common theme with merging more than one story into one. But then there was this Jesus character who stood out. Many things he said were the same things I said word for word. But there are other things he said that I never said remotely. I wasn't convinced that this was just a corruption of my own words and a personification of my own words, and that they were just misquoting me. This Jesus character seemed to be someone else entirely, who just said many of the same things I said. So I wasn't convinced that I was this Jesus character, that they've misquoted or something, but I was convinced of what they said. That while prophecies are generally not taken seriously, the compilation of prophecies here and the timing of their reference to everything going on must be taken seriously, in this case at least. The matriarch confessed that there was still much more that she couldn't talk to us about, so I was only just seeing the surface of what they couldn't tell me. She said that they'd seen into the future, and that one of us six had to make the ultimate sacrifice to go down into this world in a one-way trip to solve the problems on this world. She explained that what happens on this world decides what happens to the galaxy. That what is going on in this world is the stage of the conclusion of the billion-year-old truce. My homeworld had become the stage where the prophesied intervention would change not only the world but the entire galaxy. So perhaps there are prophecies on other worlds relating to this or something, I don't know. Both sides of the war and truce set up the truce in expectation of the eventual arrival of an intervener that would resolve their disagreement once and for all. It was explained that one of us six were the long-awaited manifestation of that intervention. The green alien woman immediately offered to be that one to make the sacrifice. But then I stopped her. I knew it had to be me. I came from this world. I am partly responsible for everything that has happened here. She eventually and reluctantly agreed, but still offered anyway. More was explained to me after that, I had to be disassembled and planted into a human fetus. They had a variety of possible choices that would fulfill the prophecies and requirements for my intervention. In the end, there were two clear choices. One was in Japan, the other was in Eastern Australia. I chose Eastern Australia. After making the choice, they agreed that it was clearly the right choice. I didn't understand the details of how it would work, but I would enter a chamber, be disassembled, and then planted into a fetus. I would forget everything, and I would never see any of them ever again. But they assured me that they would set things up so that I would remember enough that I would be able to fulfill my secret mission. The matriarch explained more about the situation to me. I wouldn't just be entering a fetus as a grown man in a child's body. I would somehow be going back in time a short way, before a certain event, so that it wouldn't happen. But it gets more strange than that. I wouldn't actually be entering the same universe. I would be entering some kind of alternate or parallel universe. Traveling back in time, you could not enter the same universe. They explained to me that they had become aware that they weren't exactly real. That they became aware that they were a kind of dream universe that wasn't yet real. And the dream was about to wake. They and their universe would cease to exist. As I understand it, there are many universes that appear and disappear all over the place as different ideas are explored, run their course, and reach a conclusion. One could say that all universes are dream universes that aren't yet real, but collectively they test the exploration of ideas, and together they slowly construct a real universe in a tree structure. The matriarch explained to me that they had seen into the future, that theirs was a dream universe that would unavoidably soon end. That the mistake they made could be attempted again and avoided. And I was the one to intervene. In some ways, all universes are connected to each other, and ideas that run their course provide input to the others. It isn't a matter of every possibility and idea being played out, only the strongest that are able to retain cohesion for a time. For all anyone knows, a conscious entity might be independently split up across all active universes and merges together after they've reached their conclusion and the dream is woken from. Whatever the case, I was to enter a chamber, become disassembled and inserted into a fetus before a certain event happens a short time after it happened. In order to change the future and try it again. There is a lot that can be said on this topic, but it would take too long to go through and difficult for most people to understand. I am to this universe like a tree passing through a length of string. It's important to understand that both the universe and the evolution of life operate on the same principle, that they are a construction process that isn't finished yet. They're still being made. Mankind itself hasn't been made yet. It's still being built. And life is being built for a purpose, to reach a destination and provide an independent input into an algorithm. I come as an outsider from an unnamed destination, a gardener to cultivate and guide life to its destination. I'm not the only gardener. I'm one of 6 identified and chosen in this galaxy alone. Those who chose me knew at least that much about me. That I was an anomaly of external intervention whose true identity was anonymous. And that I am worthy of trust as an uncorrupted force of good. And a protector and gardener of life. To cultivate life. That I was on their side. Whoever and whatever I and the other 5 others really are. Going to the chamber in a one-way trip, where I would effectively die and be born again and lose almost everything I ever was, I decided to go quietly and not tell the others of the team. But they somehow found out and intercepted me on the way. 2 of them were away on a long trip, but the other 3 came and stood in my way. After I was born, a single foundational memory remained, and it was through this memory that the rest returned as a baby. I gained all I remembered all this stuff as a baby. Before I could understand anything, I knew all this stuff. I didn't understand it at first, it didn't make any sense to me, but I had all these memories. As a very young child, they all came together. The foundational and strongest memory was of my final moments in the hangar, in my final approach to the chamber, in my one-way trip. We said our final words and goodbyes before I left. We were a team, the protectors of the galaxy across thousands of years. I was never to see them ever again. I was to lose almost everything I ever was and forget it all. But I didn't forget everything, and they will likely never know. I went into the chamber, experienced a moment of agony, and then nothing. The next thing that happened was the experience of 3 lightning strikes in a womb, and there seemed to be a vast distance of time between my final moments being disassembled and these lightning strikes. There was some kind of great distance between the two. So while I had 3 lightning strikes in the womb, I also happened to have 3 implants in my brain. Whether it's related or not, I don't know. Here's one of those implants. An encasement with solid objects with right-angled and aligned shapes, one of which has 2 thin, straight prongs protruding like a microchip, an input and an output, attached to my basal ganglia, which is the gateway to memory. According to the government, along with the 3 brain implants, scans reveal that I also have an eye implant. There's a lot that can be said on this topic and many others, with a lot of evidence and witnesses. But this video is just a story of the extraterrestrial alien part of my story. Now, I've got scans of all this stuff, of these implants, and the government has tried to remove them. Just out of curiosity, they tried to remove my eye. They wanted to cut into my brain and remove one of these implants to study it. A lot of sadistic crap. If you want to watch my story as it relates to the intervention I was to do in this world, then search my YouTube channel for the playlist The Greatest Story Ever Told, along with a variety of other related videos in other playlists, such as the Revelations playlist. Of the interventions I was to do, it involved bringing the governing authority and their political system to this world in the form of that which is known by the label of Anonymous, which I alone founded. The ideological virus problems of this world have solutions. I have the solutions, and I can prove them in debate anytime. Some of these solutions are my own, while some of these solutions have been realized and acted upon effectively by the governing authority for more than 1 billion years. These ideological viruses are not unknown to them. They are very familiar with them. These are very old and well-known ideological virus problems that have infected mankind, and that they're very familiar with, and they know how to deal with them. Mankind does not. They know how to deal with these viruses. I know how to deal with these viruses. Mankind does not. Clearly they have more expertise on how to deal with these problems than mankind does. Mankind suffers from vast ignorance on these matters. It's not some great secret mystery, complex situation and solution. It's actually quite simple. and I've been taught in their ways and solutions to the problems that plague you. I was there at the beginning of this ideological virus problem, and I am here at its end. The foundation of civilization itself is largely based on my own ideas and teachings that have been highly corrupted over 13,000 years. I have witnessed civilizations rise and fall, and I am here at the crossroads where many paths end and begin to fix it all. To fix the problems on this world and to fix the ancient problem across the garden we call the Milky Way. So if you want the rest of my story after I was planted into a fetus, watch the playlist on this YouTube channel called The Greatest Story Ever Told. But my story as it relates to the extraterrestrial involvement doesn't end there. I've been discovered and contacted by various extraterrestrial groups since my arrival in this world, or return to this world, and I will compile some examples here that I have already gone public with. But first, I will narrate a timeline of some major extraterrestrial events as they relate to the timing of my story and my arrival and mission. Mankind went to space and the moon 8 years before my return. It was some time after being informed of that when I decided to return. It was my understanding that mankind's breach of the barrier had only recently happened, in such a short time frame that they hadn't yet acted on the rule of destroying mankind, and brought it to me as a new problem. The Arecibo telescope message to aliens was sent 3 years before my return, 3 days after my birthday. The WOW signal happened at the same time I woke up in the womb, 3 months minus 3 days before I was born. The movie that dramatically changed and modernized the alien topic, the most important extraterrestrial movie of all time that people claim is based off a true story, and may very well be, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, was released 3 days after I was born. The Vrillon alien message happened 13 days after I was born. My identity and location was accidentally discovered by an alien group at the start of what became one of the world's largest UFO waves in Gosford and Wyong Shires of New South Wales, Australia in the mid to late 1990s, where thousands of people were simultaneous witnesses to many events that happened and there was mass hysteria over it. In 2001, the 1974 Arecibo message received a response at Chilbolton shortly after I started Anonymous and shortly before it became a worldwide movement. The following year on the very exact day, as Anonymous became a worldwide movement, another message was sent that read, "Beware the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises. Much pain but still time. Ill rid you. There is good out there. We oppose deception. Conduit closing. 0x07. In the Vrillon message 13 days after I was born, there are satanic New Age cult references. This message might be referring to a warning about the New Age cult. As Anonymous became a worldwide movement, I was repeatedly approached by the New Age cult, explaining that as I brought them to justice for their crimes, their exploitative crimes, they were instructed by their superiors to never fight back against me, but to observe and emulate me in hope of gaining my power. They came to me saying that they knew all about me, the drone problem, which I never mentioned to anyone, and recognised me as the one expected to come and end their old war once and for all, one way or another. Since Anonymous became a worldwide movement, almost all credible reports of alien abductions, UFO sightings and self-proclaimed contactees have completely stopped. The only existing stories in recent times are clearly insane nonsense. There are no credible stories anymore. Further alien interference has been removed from the equation, as the quarantine has been heavily enforced. a new quarantine has been placed on this world since the early 2000s. It's likely that the governing authority itself has come to enforce that quarantine from their mobile fortress. As a toddler of 2 years old, every day I went out into the backyard and drew glyphs in the dirt. There was a certain symbol I was trying to draw, but I could never get it right. I was trying to send a message to someone in the sky far away, to let them know I had arrived and that I was aware that I was here on an important secret mission I didn't yet understand. I did this every day for several months, drawing a new glyph every day. I would return each morning to see if the glyph was changed, but it never was. But then one day, it was changed into a complex geometrical shape. I wasn't sure whether my message was detected and received or if someone was messing with me. Later that day, I was walking from one room to another, and suddenly I was in a strange, distorted open space full of static. An image of several people formed in front of me. It was a family with a mother and father, a young boy and girl, and the mother holding a baby. But they weren't human. They were bipedal like a human, with 2 arms and legs, 2 eyes, etc. But they were very different. They were mostly amphibian and a little bit reptile. There was something unusual about the whole experience, as though it was artificial. It was like I was interacting with a scripted computer program as opposed to a real living creature. Sometimes it either didn't respond at all or repeated the same statement, waiting for the right response. I was told that this was a representation of them. They claimed to be our distant relatives, from a distant branch in evolution, that they originally came from this world. They showed me a family representation of them in order to express the idea that they took care of their children just like we do. They explained that they had a bad reputation and were vastly misunderstood. They evolved along a very different evolutionary path to us and everyone else. They are very aggressive and violent, but that doesn't mean they have any ill intent toward other species and us. They're also highly ritualistic. They explained to me that they communicate heavily in body language, with dominant and submissive postures, where hierarchy is very important to them. They send their children off to camps where they are trained in violence and battle each other with a high fatality rate. They showed me a family representation of them to contend with the popular myth that they sacrifice and don't care for their children. They explained that they once lived on this planet, but had to leave. A catastrophe happened with the sun, and then a meteor fell which destroyed all life on this world, making it impossible for them to live here any longer. At the time, they were very warlike, and they were fighting each other, and they were too busy fighting each other to pay attention to what happened with the sun, and they let a meteor fall and decimate the world because they were too busy focused on warring with each other. As far as they knew, all life was permanently sterilized. But life did survive and evolve again. They left the planet and stayed in the solar system for a while, mining resources for a long journey to find a new homeworld. They had limited space travel abilities at the time, but eventually survived the long journey to find a new home. They lived there for so long that they forgot where they even came from, until the events of this world became more well known and they became aware that they came from this world. They wanted me to be aware of their claim to this world. That even though they weren't claiming this world as their own to take it away from us, they wanted some role in it and they wanted their right to be recognized. They showed me some things about themselves. Here is what their ships, homeworld, and buildings look like. Their buildings were made up of identical pancake structures stacked on top of each other. Scattered randomly around the outside were egg-shaped structures. Atop each building was some kind of pointed tower that looked like a typical aerial. Their buildings were a shade of brown. Their ships were a shade of brown. Their planet was brownish. Even their bodies were brown. Everything was a shade of brown. Their ships looked very unique, with globular shapes, similar to their buildings. They looked unlike any alien ship I've ever seen, except for one example from the movie Flight of the Navigator. They were very similar to that ship, but brown with more pronounced globular shapes that curved on a different angle on the front and the sides. And there were no pointed edges. They seemed to have something against pointed edges. They explained to me that they weren't the only ones who had staked a claim on this world, and that there was a lot of fighting over it. Some groups wanted to share this world, others wanted it all to themselves. Some claims were more legitimate than others. There was no consensus on the matter. Outside of this world belonging to humans, unless they mess up and are destroyed for being invasive and violent. If mankind is destroyed, then one or more of these extraterrestrial groups get to take over. So they have a clear motive for sabotaging mankind. There were hit and run tactics being done in other groups' names to discredit their claim on this world. Violating a quarantine that was put on this world, but not heavily enforced due to a lack of resources over the drone problem. And they were doing things in each other's name in order to discredit each other's claims, but no one knew who was doing it, and they were accusing each other, and a lot of shit went down. But as I understand it, since then, heavy resources have been put into quarantining this planet, and most, if not all, extraterrestrial influences have been removed by force from the equation while I perform the intervention and give mankind one last chance. But that doesn't stop the occasional hit and run tactic of interference, especially in someone else's name. Many groups have a reason to sabotage mankind, and the governing authority seems to be the only side with mankind's interests at heart, yet at the same time threatening to destroy mankind if it fails its last chance while under quarantine. When the experience ended, I found myself back where I was, just standing there. When I was about 8 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night, injured, as though I had just fallen from a great height. I was laying in the middle of the floor of my bedroom. Something was very wrong. Eventually, I turned around and faced the other way, looking directly under the bed. I saw a golden sphere glowing brightly, with a horn sticking out of the upper right side of it. It shined so brightly that it should have been lighting up the surrounding area, but it wasn't. I stared at it for a while, very concerned and not sure what it was. Eventually, a loud robotic voice appeared in my head. It told me that I wasn't supposed to be aware of its presence, that it was there to protect me from intruders. It seemed to have done its job because it appeared that I was being taken away, and suddenly my kidnappers dropped me in the middle of the room, on the floor, and disappeared. The voice finished by instructing me to go back to bed and go to sleep. I continued staring at it for several minutes, then left the room not knowing what to do. I came back, looked under the bed, and it was still there, but it didn't say anything else. Eventually, and strangely, I went back to bed and go to sleep. As I said previously, one of the world's biggest UFO waves was in Gosford and Wyong Shires, the central coast of New South Wales, Australia, in the mid to late 1990s. I used to take people out at night and predictably show them 50 UFOs in an hour. I was mocked by others who refused to look for themselves until it became widespread and thousands of people were seeing them come down in close range. It developed into mass hysteria. You can look up on YouTube Gosford Files for an example of what I'm talking about. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what happened. A lot happened, and there was a media blackout over it, and no one would talk about it. And there was mass hysteria over this happening every day. Many of them flew in formation and made instant right-angled turns. Unusual stars in the sky would suddenly move with no acceleration shortly after looking at them, as though they knew that I was watching them. One particular event was when I was in my bedroom one Tuesday night. I think I was 17, so that would have been in 1995, I think. I heard a strange pulsating sound like this. It was playing the same note, but at different speeds, like it was changing gears. It was getting louder and fainter, as though it was travelling large distances in a short time and seemed to be moving randomly all around the sky. At first I didn't know what to make of it, but I quickly became concerned. Suddenly I'm blind and all I can see is black. Then an image of an emaciated alien appeared in front of me, with his forehead against mine. He looked a little bit like a grey, a little bit like a human, probably more human than grey, but I don't think he was some kind of hybrid. He was so skinny that the bones were showing in his face, but he didn't look weak or sick. It just looked like that was how they naturally were. His own mind overlapped with mine, and I could see his own thoughts. He told me that they were looking for someone else, not me, and that they weren't aware of me yet. He told me to hide and not let them find me. I was going to acknowledge him, but decided to probe his mind. He was unprepared and resisted, but I quickly overpowered him. I got inside his mind so far that I could see through his eyes and move his own body. He was sitting down, facing some kind of panel with a screen on it. I turned him around and looked behind him, and this is what I saw. He was in a circular ship. They were high up, above the planet. There were two others you can see in orange. One was sitting down, facing the other way, doing something. The other, on the right, was standing up, fiddling with some kind of long device. I stared at the one standing up for a while. He eventually noticed, stopped what he was doing and stared back at me, confused at why I was staring at him. He eventually shrugged it off and went back to what he was doing. Suddenly I could sense a reaction from the alien I took control of, to the equivalent of, oh shit. He realised that I had taken over his body and that I was doing the movements, not him. He didn't seem to realise this at first, that I was doing this, but then he did realise. He quickly turned around, pressed a button on the panel, and suddenly I was kicked back to the dark space with his head against mine. He just repeated the same message he said before. This time I acknowledged him and said I would hide. Then his head disappeared, and suddenly I could see again. I tried to hide, but all I could do was hide under a blanket. The pulsating sound eventually stopped nearby, then slowly got louder as though it found me and was slowly coming up to me. The sound got so loud that it felt like I was inside the room. It was like having your head right up next to a subwoofer. Everything around me began to distort, and time itself seemed to slow down, but my mind didn't. Suddenly, I got a piercing headache. A few seconds later, it suddenly stopped. It went on and off a couple of more times, as though I was being scanned. Then distortion and slowing down of time continued to grow until time eventually seemed to completely stop. A moment later, it quickly went back to normal speed and went away. It didn't come back. I eventually went upstairs and noticed that I had about, 45 minutes of time missing. While I was upstairs, the sound eventually came back. But it was different. It wasn't just changing frequency, it was changing pitch too, as though it was rotating through specific gears. Eventually, I went outside to see this thing with my own eyes, once and for all, after what it just did to me. This is what I saw for about 10 to 15 seconds, gliding across the sky as it pulsated. In this next example, I went out for dinner that night. I shaved at 7 PM, went out for dinner, came home and had a typical late night on my computer. In the early hours of the morning, I finally went to sleep. The next thing I know, all I can see is a very basic childlike drawing of a tree, grass and a table with blue sky. I'm staring at this image, mindlessly mesmerised by it in a trance, like it's the focus of my trance. Eventually, I realise something's wrong and begin questioning it. I slowly gain my intellectual abilities and break free of the trance. And suddenly I snap out of it and realise I'm in a dark, empty room. You can see this room in the diagram here, at the bottom right of this map. I didn't know if I was the only one there, but I suspected I wasn't. Before looking around, I noticed a door to the left and got out of there as quickly as I could. I came into a new room. On the left, there was a large square object in the corner taking up a large portion of the room. It was too dark to make out whatever it was. There were some other things in the room, but I couldn't make it out. There was another door to my right. I went into the next room, and there were large circular bottles of some sort and rectangular planks piled up messily on top of each other around the corner of the room. I went through the next door to the right, and it led to a long curved hallway with a series of windows. I looked through the second window and found that I was in some kind of facility in a tunnel void of space, with a defined edge that had distorted portals normal open space. There might have been a door or two on the left, but I wasn't paying attention to that. I realised I was far away from home. I went through the hallway and the door at the end, which led to an open space. There might have been a door or two on the left, but I wasn't paying attention to that. In front of me was a series of stairs leading to a large domed archway with a glowing light coming from it. I intended to go up there, but as soon as I took a few steps, half a dozen small grey-like creatures came walking out of the archway and down the stairs. They weren't like typical greys. They were muscular, not frail, and smaller than a grey. They happily moved about with energy like children swinging about and playing. Halfway down the stairs, they spotted me and stopped. They were surprised to see me, but not concerned. I could hear in my head one of them saying, "Oh, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here." I tried to speak back in my head in the same way I heard them, and they were able to understand me. I had a coherent civil conversation with them as I would with any other person. I asked them questions and they answered them all. When asked about how we were able to communicate, they explained that they were able to use their voice just like I did, but preferred not to. They had devices scattered around the roof and walls that enabled everyone to talk directly through thought, and this was much more efficient. The way I was receiving their words wasn't in the same order as English, but it actually made more sense. I don't think they were communicating in my language. The devices seemed to have been translating and converting it all. Nonetheless, we were able to have a normal conversation. They were very talkative. I asked them about what I saw from the window and they explained the portals were very difficult to make, and they were entry points into different places and times in our universe. The conversation went into why I was there and what they were doing. They explained that they were from the distant future, near the final stages of the universe. After a time of peace, war happened and everyone began distancing themselves from each other. there was technology at that time where one could weave space around itself and create a bubble of space out of nothing, and stretch space around it and seal it up as though it was never there. They could exist in their own universe, a bubble of space separated to the universe it was weaved out of. In this space, they said they had more control over it than normal space. They explained that they were entering the universe at different places and times and covertly taking wasted resources that no one would miss. I got upset at what they were doing and became violent. They became scared, and then suddenly they weren't scared anymore. They seemed to be trying to get my attention and delaying me while someone came up behind me. Then I'm suddenly hit in the back of my head by something that caused extreme nausea, and I quickly fell to the ground and blacked out. The next thing I know, I wake up sitting in a chair with two of them operating a device attached to my head. I asked them what they were doing, and they explained that they were harvesting chemicals from my brain. According to them, there were two brain chemicals that we humans had that they had a use for. Whenever they found some of it, they got very excited. They were very excitable and childlike. They explained that we still made certain brain chemicals from earlier in our evolution that we didn't use anymore. According to them, they were harvesting chemicals we no longer used or needed. I got upset again, but there was nothing I could do. After a while, they put me back to sleep. The next thing I know, I'm in my bed, upside down and back to front on an awkward angle like I was clumsily dumped there. I was suffering extreme nausea. I tried to get up. I had extreme pain in my foot, and I couldn't walk on it. I had a blister in that location, and the pain seemed to be from an injection site that went deep into the bones of my foot. I went to my computer to tell my friends what had just happened. I noticed that time-wise, it was shortly after I went to sleep. While suffering from extreme nausea, I wasn't tired. I felt like I'd been sleeping for days. Then I noticed I had a beard, but I shaved only a few hours ago. Wherever I was, a lot of time must have gone by, and I seemed to have been put back shortly after I was taken. Those aliens claimed to be covertly taking resources that no one would miss, doing it undetected and not making an impact on events. Well, here I was, seriously injured and affected by them and a memory of what happened. They seemed to have no concern or recognition for the impact they were having on others, and they also seemed to be lying. They seemed to be covert parasites on mankind, and who knows who else on what scale. Who knows the extent of damage they were doing to the timeline and the targets of their parasitism. I took photos of the injection site and the beard and sent them to my friends to prove what had happened. I still have some of those photos, and those friends that I sent all this stuff to can confirm everything. The injection site got worse over several months, and took a long time to heal. The green alien woman, while she had big black eyes, her face looked very human-like. Her disposition was very human-like as well. In the early days, I noticed that her tentacle hair looked different sometimes. There were other species that had tentacles too, such as the big one of us six, who was very different and had a giant elephant type of trunk and arms that were similar. If he could move them, I wondered if she could move her hair, since it would seem to be different sometimes. I asked her if she could. She thought the idea was funny. She seemed a little bit flattered about it and said she wished she could, as though that was some kind of burden of annoyance that haunted her. She said they had a mind of their own. They changed depending on her emotional state and the environment. They seemed to have more than one function, but one of which, and the primary function, seemed to be that they were to moderate body temperature. I should also mention something about language. The original language I spoke 13,000 years ago didn't last for 6,000 years during my time as a messenger. In the first few thousand years, the language changed a bit, and I was able to work with the changes. But as time went on, new languages became dominant, and I had to trace human migrations to find those who knew my language, so that I was able to speak to mankind and give them messages. As time went on, it was increasingly difficult to communicate with mankind, because I spoke an old language that faded out of general use. It's important to understand that I spoke in what became a very old language that became symbolically important in a similar way to how we use Greek and Roman today. Stories were passed down about me over thousands of years, and that includes the language I spoke. Historians, philosophers, and religious leaders learned my language so that they would be able to talk to me when I returned. I would return after decades or hundreds of years to a new generation of people waiting for someone their ancestors spoke about. So while my language faded out of general use, it was also preserved among the most educated, so they could speak to me during each return. It became increasingly difficult to communicate with mankind as time went on, and I had to rely on experts to pass down my language. I dealt with the general population directly, but I needed experts to translate verbal language for me. As time went on, I focused more of my time speaking only to experts who were progressively harder to find. As alien hybrids, their culture and technology came to override human civilization in the late stages of my time as a messenger. The tradition of learning my language and following my teachings were largely abandoned. I was a relic from the past, speaking a forgotten language. I was progressively disconnected from the very people I was trying to save. I was progressively disconnected from everyone on all sides. Communicating with the meddlers and the separatists wasn't a problem though, because I used a translation device to speak to them. I had no such translation device to speak with humans in their own languages. There's a very important point here that most people will have difficulty facing. When mankind is placed under a quarantine during an evaluation period of whether it will be accepted into the galactic community or destroyed to protect it, that doesn't necessarily apply to all life on this planet, and that includes other human races. The chosen race for civilization 13,000 years ago was only the white race. The introduction of civilization was never intended for the non-white world. They were a long way away from being ready for it, and introducing them to such things would harm their evolution and cause them to become a destructive problem for everyone else. They were to be introduced to civilization and later into the galactic community in their own time. It was time for the white race, and only the white race. Civilization and technology was to be strictly kept away from the non-white human races until they were ready, just as it was kept away from the white race until it was ready. So now that mankind is under evaluation for its entry into the galactic community, only the white race is being considered here. The non-white world is not ready yet, but since the non-white world has been given access to white civilization and technology, including space travel, that puts the non-white world at serious risk of being exterminated by the governing authority. This scenario could play out in a variety of ways, but in none of those ways are the non-white world introduced into the galactic community at this point in time. If the white race does not pass its evaluation period and has to be destroyed, the non-white world will be destroyed along with it. If the white race is accepted into the galactic community, the non-white world might still be eradicated if it continues to be a threat to the white race and the galactic community. Eradicated by the white race if it continues to be a threat to them. Eradicated by the galactic community if it continues to be a threat to them. In both cases, quarantined on this world until further notice. In some cases, quarantined to a specific part of this world and then eradicated if they continue their violations. Let's consider Islam here, for example. The governing authority will likely intervene as it did in the past and engage in mass exterminations in defense of the white race if the white race is accepted into the galactic community. The non-white world is to be quarantined on this world until further notice, while their own survival depends on whether the white race is accepted into the galactic community. Foolish non-whites must understand that their very attacks against the white race are an attack against the only hope for their own survival. Should they destroy the white race, then they will be exterminated by the governing authority. Should the white race survive and the non-white world doesn't change their ways, they will be exterminated by the white race with the help of the governing authority if necessary. It is likely the case that a large portion of the non-white world will be exterminated. The question is, how much of it can be salvaged, if any at all? I believe in giving everyone a chance, but I will not give the guilty a chance at the cost of the innocent. So with this whole story in mind, understand that there are extraterrestrial influences pulling the puppet strings of mankind to fuck up the evaluation period, resulting in the destruction of all mankind and leaving the world for someone else to claim as their own. Those in the know within the non-white world know that they have no chance to gain entry into the galactic community, and that they will quickly fall even further behind the white race as a result of the white race being accepted into the galactic community. The puppet strings of their destructively competitive nature, combined with the extraterrestrial meddling pulling their puppet strings, has led them into being sacrificial puppets of their own demise, and they are too hopelessly blinded by greed, jealousy, and fear associated with psychological projection to see the consequences of what they are doing. Some people in current positions of illegitimate power within both the white and non-white world are foolish enough to think that they can keep this world in a long-term quarantine state while making secret deals with extraterrestrial meddlers in order to hold on to power and siphon even more power secretly and manipulatively from extraterrestrials. They think they can outsmart all extraterrestrials in their plan to reign supreme over this world at any cost, and they would gamble everyone's future over it. As far as they're concerned, they would rather see the world burn than let go of their illegitimate power. And they know that if the white race is accepted into the galactic community, their empire of lies will no longer exist. And the only extraterrestrials who would even attempt to work with such psychopaths are those who are also trying to destroy the world.